Hello friends, today I'm going to be telling you the unusual and extraordinary career of Yosef Schmidt. His story always amazes people when they first find it out. It's so unlike any other operatic tenor. In 1933, he was the most popular tenor in Europe, especially in Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Austria, that area. And yet, he could no longer sing on the radio or record records. He was so small that he was not able to have a successful stage career, and he lost a number of positions that he could have had because of his height. So what is his story? He was born in Bukovina, which is in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, which was in the area. It was originally in Romania, and then it ended up being in the Ukraine, so it moved back and forth. When he was a young boy, his parents moved to Sinowitz, which is a town in the Ukraine that's probably 100,000 people. He felt much safer there, and it was over 60% Jewish, and they had over 40 synagogues there. I didn't know there were towns like that were that big in Europe. It was a German-speaking part of Europe, which came in handy later on for him. When he was a child, he started singing in the synagogue, and he started getting training there. And he had such a great voice, even as a child, that they started really giving him extra lessons and things. And singing in the synagogue is really hard, and a lot of opera singers started out singing as cantors, and later in his career, people listened to him sing and they said, "Oh, he's Jewish. He trained in a synagogue," because of the extreme dexterity of his singing when he did a very fast, florid singing. His father only heard him sing as a cantor because he thought that all the other singing that he did was profane. The first time he applied to be a cantor, he was rejected because of his height. And so, how tall was he? Well, officially it was said that he was 4'10", which is the same height as Judy Garland, who was tiny. But testimony of people who had seen him live and had met him and seen him with other people said no, he was not that tall. He was more like 4'7". And if you look at pictures, which I will show a couple, you'll see he's just much smaller, more like childlike inside. We would call him today a little person. When he sang in his concerts, quite often people would just gasp when he would walk out because he was so tiny. In concerts, if he ever sang concerts, he never would sing just opera. He would sing popular songs of the day and lieder. He moved to Berlin when he was 20, and he started studying with an excellent teacher who was the teacher of the famous baritone Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. And he trained with him for a good while, and he was getting some gigs as cantor in Berlin. But then in 1926, he was recruited for, he had to automatically serve in the Romanian army. But he was so tiny, he really wasn't of any use in the field, so they found out that he could sing, so he ended up singing for the officers. When he came back to Berlin, the size kept being a problem, but then all of a sudden he got a lucky break. Lucky breaks can play a big part in people's careers. You've probably heard of the great Maria Callas, the great operatic soprano. Well, Callas really grew her fame because of records, 33 RPM records that had just come on the scene when she started really becoming famous. And it was the records that really got her international fame. Well, Yosef's break came in radio. At the time, in the late 20s, money was tight in Europe, and there was just not enough money to put on operas all the time because there just wasn't the budget. But radio had really taken off in Europe, and people love listening to the radio, and Europe has a big audience for opera. And so in Berlin, which was sort of the center of the recording radio studios of Germany and the German-speaking part of the world, he started being the go-to tenor, and he recorded just countless roles, and he was very versatile. He could sing in just about any type of a role. One of the interesting things about Schmidt was people who heard him live said that the voice was not nearly as beautiful live. It was almost hoarse sounding. And it wasn't a very big voice, but somehow or other, this voice was just born for the radio and for recordings. It recorded so beautifully. There are some really great operatic sopranos, like Birgit Nilsson, who said she just never really likes the sound of her voice, never records the way that she hears it. And his voice recorded more beautifully than it actually was. And he became hugely popular. He was the top-selling German singing tenor of the period before World War II. And recently there was a 10 CD set of recordings that he made. And these were just the ones they could find. A lot of them were lost. And very few other opera singers of that period have that type of a catalog to show you. In 1933, the Nazis really started coming to power. And one of the first things that they did was they forbade Jews from being on the radio and from recording for records. So all of a sudden, that big ticket for him was gone. But yet again, an extraordinary act of fate happened. He had been hired to do a voiceover for a movie, and movies were really starting to take off in Berlin, which was the seat of the German movie making in the world. And they really liked him, and so they decided to try him in movies, and they could film him so that he would look much more like a normal-sized person. And people just loved him. He was a huge star. He made a movie called The Song Goes Round the World. And it was the biggest movie in Germany. Okay, now, how could he become a big movie star if he was not allowed to sing on the radio or in records? Well, because the Nazis had not figured out yet how to control the theaters. The theaters could play anything they wanted to play, and there was no law that forbade that. And he was the biggest money maker for them, so they would keep playing him all the way up into the time when Jews were completely forbidden from being shown in the theaters. And they finally got that power, but that wasn't up until much later. He ended up touring the U.S., and a bittersweet thing happened. He got a job as a singer on the GM, General Motors Hour. And he was singing with the two other biggest tenors of the world at the time, which was Jussi Björling and Richard Tauber. And they would take turns singing on a Sunday night. But it somehow or other just didn't take off. And if it had, he could have stayed in the States, and he could have avoided all the horrible fate that happened to him. But it just wasn't to be. And he went back to Austria just right before everything went to hell in a handbasket. And I'm not going to belabor the point on all the horrible things that happened to him, because it was very unpleasant. But I'll give you the rough digest. The French captured him, and they delivered him to the Nazis in Switzerland, and he was put in a work camp in Switzerland near Zurich. And he was pretty much worked to death. He froze because he didn't have enough clothes. And my sister lived in Switzerland when she was younger. She says it's freezing. And he got sick and he didn't get the care that he needed. And so he passed away at a very young age, in his late 30s. But the thing that is exciting and kind of wonderful about this was, in the camp, they were forbid to make any sort of congregation, where they would congregate in assembly or anything. And yet 160 of the fellow inmates gathered together to pay homage to him, and the guards looked the other way. It says a lot about him. And he was just loved wherever he went. He was singled out for an honor. A star was named after him by an astronomer, which I think is great. And the really wonderful thing about him is that there's a whole new generation that are coming up that are learning to appreciate him. And a lot of this is because of YouTube. There are a lot of compilations of his work. You can listen to a lot of his arias and excerpts from his movies. And remember, he was just a huge movie star. You can even see the whole movies on there. And I just discovered him recently, and I just thought it was an extraordinary story, and I wanted to share it with you. Now, I'm going to play the media part of my presentation, and the first part is an excerpt of him singing as a cantor. And you can hear what I was saying. It's more difficult than opera music. It's really difficult stuff. And a lot of these tenors went on to become great opera singers because they had these great skills they acquired from singing this horrendously, fiendishly difficult music. And then after that, I'm going to play an aria of him from the opera Martha. It's a very famous tenor aria, and you can get a sense of how mesmerizing he was on stage. And you can hear his beautiful, beautiful voice. I've enjoyed sharing with you this story about Schmidt and what an extraordinary career he had. Now I want you to stay and see him in action. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.